Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Donald Trump found guilty on all 34 counts in his hush money trial in a verdict that could reshape the U.S. political landscape ahead of the presidential election.
This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
The rand weakens as investors position themselves for a coalition government in South Africa, with the ANC looking set to lose its parliamentary majority. And Bloomberg reveals that U.S. officials are slowing AI chip exports to the Middle East amid a national security review. Well, good morning again. It has just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Joumanna Bercetche in Dubai. There is so much to get through on our show today. We're going to talk about all of the top political stories. Before that, as ever, a quick check on how markets are faring. And the picture yesterday was one of risk off for Wall Street. We saw both the S&P and the Nasdaq end in the red after those U.S. GDP revisions came out softer than the market had been anticipating. Fed's Williams on the tapes talking about policy being restrictive, but also in his view that inflation will continue to decelerate in the coming months. Of course, a key indicator coming up later today for investors, that is that PCE number. We will, of course, talk more about that on the show. But this is the picture today. The futures are seen opening lower to the tune of about 0.1%. The Nasdaq 100 yesterday closing down 1%. One stock we are focused on there is NVIDIA. A lot of the chip makers sold off after this Bloomberg story came out saying that the U.S. are restricting and slowing down licenses of AI chip sales to the Middle East. So very interesting, particularly in the region that we're in. 10-year yield sitting at around 4.54, struggling to break through 4.5 meaningfully. And then Brent obviously in focus. We haven't mentioned it yet, but OPEC Plus this Sunday. So lots going on in the markets. A quick look at the terminal chart, because I thought this was interesting ahead of that OPEC meeting. Look at the positioning in oil. Brent crude shorts surge. So what we're seeing here is speculative bearish positioning is reaching quite extreme levels, i.e. the market is short. So if you get a hawkish surprise out of OPEC Plus this weekend, that could be quite troubling for those positions in that space. Something to bear in mind. We'll talk more about it. All right, our top story this morning. Donald Trump is calling it a disgrace after a rigged trial. The Biden campaign says it proves no one is above the law. A New York jury has convicted the former president on all 34 counts in his hush money trial.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
Sentencing is scheduled for July 11, just days before the Republican convention that's set to nominate Trump for another run at the White House. Now, joining us now from Washington is Bloomberg's U.S. government editor, John Harney. John, good morning to you. Thank you for staying up so late for us. Look, this is a real moment in U.S. history. It is unprecedented that a former president has now become a convicted felon. Maybe let me just start off by asking you what exactly President Trump has been found guilty of.
The case revolved around a payment to an adult film star who says she had a sexual relations with Trump back in 2006. The charges concerned allegations that business records were falsified to conceal a payment to her, and in doing so, and that the motive for this was so her story, her account of what happened with Donald Trump, which he denies. He says he did not have a relationship with her. That these payments were essentially for her silence, so it would not come out during the 2016 election.
So let's talk about what happens next. We know the sentencing date is July 11th. If he is convicted and sentenced to go to jail, what is the likelihood that former President Trump actually ends up in jail?
Well, I mean, all these questions are new, and we don't know. He cannot file an appeal until the sentencing takes place. Once an appeal is filed, it could go to higher courts in New York State, where this trial took place, and into federal court, and perhaps all the way to the Supreme Court ultimately. Um, it you know as for sentencing, he could get probation, he could get home confinement, or he could get imprisonment. But the question would be, he's still protected by the Secret Service, as all former presidents and presidents are. What kind of extraordinary arrangements would have to be made for his incarceration if that happens?
We're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today on the show. A major story out of the U.S. Bloomberg's U.S. government editor, John Harney, in Washington. Well, South Africa's ruling party is predicted to fall well short of obtaining a parliamentary majority for the first time since coming to power at the end of apartheid 3 decades ago. Modeling suggests the ANC is on course to win 42% of the votes cast in Wednesday's election and probably needs to partner with one of its biggest rivals to retain power. That is unnerving financial markets, with the rand weakening since vote counting began. Let's bring in our Chief Africa correspondent, Jennifer Zavazajja, who is in Midrand at the National Results Center. So just over 51% of the votes have now been counted. How is it looking?
Yeah, that's right. Good morning to you, Joumanna. As you mentioned, yes, we're just about 52% of the voting districts that are counted. I believe I was looking at just over 7 million votes counted. But as you mentioned, the indications are really that it's looking like the ruling party is going to dip below this majority if these results currently hold. Now, behind me, though, it's interesting. It has all of the various districts in the provinces that we're paying close attention to. And what we know at this point in time is that the ANC, which is the ruling party, has lost out in some of the districts that, traditionally they've done quite well in, and have lost out, in particular, to former President Jacob Zuma's MK party. That party is only 6 months old, but is doing surprisingly well in a number of smaller districts, in particular, KwaZulu-Natal, which is where we were just earlier this week. And so the question is, what does the rest of the day hold for the ANC, and in particular in the most populous here in Gauteng?
And Jennifer, we've been talking all of this week throughout your extraordinary coverage on the ground about ANC and what's at stake for them, the fact that they're losing a lot of support. What is sentiment on the ground now? Are people surprised that it looks like ANC are losing their overall majority if these polls stay the way they are?
Right. I think, Joumanna, people are quite surprised, and I think also a bit unnerved. You mentioned the markets, just because there is a lot of uncertainty about what this could potentially look like, and especially if we think about what the past few months of campaigning have been. We have heard, in particular from the ANC, saying that they would not want to work with a party like the MK, but if these results continue to track and they are going to have to partner up with one of their main rivals, what does that look like in terms of governing? What does that look like in terms of policies that are implemented, and also potential ministers that are elected into office? And so, the real question is, what is going to happen if these results track? What are the coalition discussions going to be like? We're still waiting on a number of votes to come in. We're unlikely to get the final results until the weekend, and then thereafter likely to start hearing about the coalition talks. But the question is, what of these main rivals of the ANC, who is going to be willing to partner up with them? And what are the potential concessions then that the ruling party is going to have to give into?
Yeah, big questions as we head into the weekend. Jennifer, thank you so much for your coverage this week. That was Jennifer Zavazajja, our Chief Africa correspondent and co-anchor for Bloomberg Horizons. Now, Saudi Arabia has now confirmed plans to sell Aramco shares in a deal that could raise as much as $12 billion as it seeks funds to pay for a massive economic transformation plan. The sale is due to begin on Sunday, which is also the same day OPEC Plus members are meeting to discuss oil output cuts. So let's bring in Anthony De Paula, our Middle East energy markets reporter. Well, now we have confirmation that Aramco are indeed going for this share sale. There had been speculation that it was happening on Sunday. Let's just put our investor hat on and think about, the opportunity this affords to the investment community, because the stock itself is trading at quite expensive valuations. But then you and I have spoken about that hefty dividend payout that Aramco offers.
Yeah, those are the things that people are going to have to weigh. It's a particular stock because it is the largest exporter of crude oil in the world. It's basically a government-owned company. So investors haven't had access to this kind of company up until 5 years ago when they did do the IPO, like they have had access to the international oil companies, the likes of ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, etc. So it's a particular company there in that you're getting into some of that Saudi Arabian oil wealth, but it is trading at a high price ratio related to those other rivals. One thing that's important, though, that's underpinning that stock is that dividend. They've got a very healthy base dividend, which they've said, and they reiterated on a conference call late last evening after this was announced. The CEO and CFO reiterated that will be stable and growing, so it gives kind of a floor for returns for those investors. Plus, they've got that special dividend, which is going to be about $124 billion throughout this year. And then there's a question about what is going to happen to that next year when we are expecting a little bit of a weaker market.
Yeah, I guess it explains now why they kept that dividend in place a couple of weeks ago. Maybe somewhat of a coincidence. It's happening the same day as OPEC Plus. But I do want to ask you, what the considerations are going into this OPEC Plus meeting. I think we've spoken about this before. Nobody's expecting any change in those production curbs. But Bloomberg are out with a report overnight suggesting that maybe those production curbs could stay in place until 2025. Would that be a hawkish surprise?
Yeah, for sure. That's a possibility. I mean, it's perhaps a coincidence that these two things are happening at the same time, but whether it is or isn't, it does underline the fact that oil prices are so important to Saudi Arabia's economy. They're bringing in money from this secondary offering, which is going to start book building on Sunday, just as the OPEC Plus group is meeting. And as you said, they are expected to roll over the cuts that are currently in place. So that's bringing Saudi production down to about 9 million barrels a day. And what the Saudis are doing here is that they're taking the bet that producing fewer barrels but at a higher price will net them more money than putting, say, 11 million barrels a day onto the market at a lower price. So they're really trying to shore that up. And as I said, that market looks weaker next year, so they might have to continue those cuts into next year.
I mean, there's so many different factors they have to take into consideration. Many of these OPEC producers have extra capacity. There's spare capacity sitting idly. But at the same time, the demand outlook is interesting. And I think the signs coming out of China the last few months have been quite worrying.
This is one of those things that people have been waiting since COVID for really China to keep coming back. And it's been a slow return, which has made that increase in oil prices come more slowly. And people are now concerned about some of the strength of that growth in demand. So we do still see demand growing, but it's the question of how strongly it grows, and that's really what's underpinning the market and the prices now, and that's really what OPEC Plus is going to be trying to shore up on Sunday and into next year.
And obviously Aramco as well. I mean, ultimately, if you're buying a piece of Aramco, you're buying a piece of what future oil demand looks like. That's the question for investors. Anthony, thank you so much. Great to have you with us. Anthony De Paula, our Middle East energy markets reporter. Well, still ahead on our show, hear why Capital Link says the Fed seems to be watching a different movie than the rest of the world. The CEO, Brett McGonegal, explains in a moment. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joumanna Bercetche in Dubai. Let's take a quick look at how global bonds are faring now. And the picture for many of these bonds has been one of yields moving higher over the course of this week. Today, the Kiwi bonds are about 7.5 basis points lower. But throughout the course of the week, of course, there has been that push from U.S. Treasuries. U.S. Treasuries not shown here, but are sitting above 4.5%. But in the past couple of days, given the risk-off rally that transpired yesterday for U.S. equities, we have come back somewhat to 4.5%. Joining us now is Capital Link CEO Brett McGonegal. Wonderful to have you with us. Well, we previewed this segment with this big statement you said, which is the Fed is watching a different movie from the rest of us. What movie are the Fed watching? What movie are we watching, actually?
If someone can tell me what movie they're watching, I'd love to know. But it seems
not Armageddon.
Yeah, it seems like it's either way out of date or too far in the future. But they seem to not really be grasping what's in front of them. I mean, the U.S. economy in no way is deserving of this hawkish behavior out of the Fed. And I think everyone's trying to figure out what they're doing and when they're going to do it. And I think they're going to miss this opportunity, and then it becomes largely political. After June, you have July, August, you have the election in November, and I think that anything that's going to be done in September is going to be too close to the election. So I think they're putting themselves in a corner again. Yeah.
What is it about the data that you're finding worrying? I mean, yes, we got a small downgrade to GDP, but we're nowhere near recession territory.
Yeah, no, I think so. I look at something a little bit different than I think what everyone else is looking at, in the sense that if you look at the global players, and you look at China and the U.S. dominating, GDP growth and the global markets, I just don't understand how you can have two diametrically opposed monetary policies coming out of the two largest economies. I think the Chinese economy and the PBOC is much more hands-on and really understanding what's going on, whereas the Fed isn't.
Can I push back on that?
Sure.
The U.S. are not facing a property slowdown as big as China are right now.
No, they're not. But
it.
I just don't think that you can have China sputtering like they are and have it not affect the world, especially not affect the U.S. And the divergence is just so big. My feeling is that they have a more acute understanding of what's going on, and I think that the U.S. will be dragged down by it, and that's why I think that they're off the...
So assume your thesis is correct and that the Fed are asleep at the wheel when they should be cutting interest rates. What impact is that going to have on markets?
Well, I think what happens right now is, as you see, every single piece of data that comes out has a resounding effect on the market. That's not what the Fed should be doing. The Fed should not be having everybody on this cliffhanger looking at every piece of data and having the markets respond to it.
Did I mention PCE today, for example?
Yeah, well, that's going to be the big one.
Yeah.
But like a steady hand on the wheel is something that the global markets look at the Fed. They're the big boy in the room that's supposed to be able to do it properly. And I just don't like the fact that they're allowing so much interpretation of every piece of economic data, and they're increasing volatility in the market where they're supposed to be the stabilizer. So I think that they're just on the wrong foot.
Yeah. Does that mean higher for longer will eventually break equity markets?
I don't think it will. I've been a long believer that the only game in town is equity markets right now. The fixed income markets around the globe are, just sputtering. There's not really any groundswell there. And the U.S. market has really taken a lead with these mega caps and everyone hiding in these 7 names. I don't think that breaks. I think that the play will be into U.S. equities. I think the Fed will finally start cutting, and I think everybody, will applaud that. And then hopefully be on to the next phase of what's going on, which is where do we go post the election? How does the new president or a new president or Biden reset global priorities, and how do we start operating in I think a more accommodative global policy role, which hopefully the U.S. will be will lead into this next.
So since you bring up U.S. elections, I'm just going to ask for an investor view of the news overnight. Now that the former Trump is
look,
a convicted
Trump has a way of just always making a headline. It's like when you think he can't make a new headline, this one isn't a great headline. I don't think it changes anything. Being an American and knowing how the election cycle goes. I mean, Trump's biggest lead was yesterday posted, right? The day before he gets the jury, the court ruling. I think that he's going to actually end up getting a bigger groundswell, because I think people are going to start to play into this conspiracy theory that everyone's against him and he's not going to get a fair election, he didn't get a fair trial. I'm not necessarily a believer of that, but I think that that's where it goes, and I think his lead will increase, actually. All right. Well, that's a good place to leave it. Brett, thank you so much for coming on the show and giving us all of your views on what movies we should be watching. Brett McGonegal, Capital Link CEO. Thank you.
Also coming up on our show, the U.S. and Chinese defense ministers to meet for the first time at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue. We are live at the summit in Singapore next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joumanna Bercetche in Dubai. Tensions between the U.S. and China are taking center stage at this year's Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. The summit brings together global defense ministers and hundreds of delegates to address regional and international security challenges. Let's cross over to the summit and bring in Bloomberg Markets Asia anchor Haslinda Amin. Wonderful to have you with us, Haslinda, on our show. Interesting time to be holding a defense summit. We talk about tensions on the South China Sea, Taiwan, obviously the war that's raging in the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, still very much on people's minds. How has that shaped the narrative this year at the summit?
Well, interesting. I mean, you talk about all those potential flashpoints. It is front and center as well as the U.S.-China relations. In fact, it is key to this particular summit. We're waiting to see the handshake between the defense ministers of both sides. We have Austin, of course, and Dong expected to shake hands at 1 p.m. local time. Now, this is the first time that they're meeting face-to-face on the back of escalating tensions between the two sides. We know that military relations broke down and resumed only a year ago, but where that might lead us amid that reimposition of tariffs on Chinese products remains to be seen. People are hoping that it would be more than just a handshake, that it'll have perhaps candid friend talks, which are needed to get relations back to be normalized. Now, apart from that, Joumanna, people are also talking about the situation in Ukraine. That could be front and center as well. It is into the third year of the war, and countries like Lithuania saying that we possibly have not seen the worst. It is among Baltic nations perhaps that are vulnerable to Russia's imperial goals, perhaps, and they say that tensions are rising. You bring in Trump, which is at the front and center of the news today, and of course Trump has said that he wants to pull back on its commitment to NATO.
And Haslinda, let me just ask you very quickly, the keynote speech, Philippines president, what should we watch out for?
Well, the South China Sea. We know that President Marcos has been pushing back on aggression by the Chinese in that area. He wants, to bring relations back to an even keel. He does not want to poke the bear, he says. So it would be interesting in terms of messaging that he has for the Chinese. Joumanna.
Thank you so much for that overview. And of course, all eyes will be on that keynote speech later today. Also coming up on Bloomberg Horizons, we are going to be talking a lot more about the South African election as the votes continue to trickle in. We speak to William Gumede, the founder and executive of Democracy Works. Good morning. This is Horizons Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Donald Trump found guilty on all 34 counts in his hush money trial in a verdict that could reshape the U.S. political landscape ahead of the presidential election.
Disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
The rand weakens as investors position themselves for a coalition government in South Africa, with the ANC looking set to lose its parliamentary majority. And Bloomberg reveals that U.S. officials are slowing AI chip exports to the Middle East amid a national security review. And it's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Joumanna Bercetche in Dubai. Some major political news this morning with that conviction of former President Donald Trump. We will speak more about it on our show. But for now, let's just take another look at how these markets have been faring, because yesterday was a bit of a down day. We saw the S&P and NASDAQ see some losses into the close. Some of those chip makers came under heavy selling pressure after that Bloomberg story emerged, suggesting that U.S. had been restricting or slowing licenses for AI chip equipment to the Middle East for some of those key chip makers. So very important for the chip making community. One of the reasons why the Nasdaq ended down 1% yesterday. S&P seen opening also in the red this morning, down 0.2%. Big focus for investors today will be that core PCE number. As we know, the Fed likes to look at that one as a sense for inflationary dynamics. 10-year yields sitting at 4.54. We rallied 5 basis points given the turnaround in risk. And then Brent, we're watching very closely into that OPEC Plus meeting this weekend. Again, I want to flag to you here a Bloomberg story that came out overnight suggesting from our conversations with some officials that a possible extension of those production curbs to 25 is on their mind as well. So we don't have confirmation of that, but something to bear in mind. And the reason I'm saying that is because if you take a look at positioning, take a look at this. Bearish positioning, i.e. investor speculative short positioning in oil is at very close to record highs, which tells you that if indeed we do get a hawkish surprise out of OPEC Plus, it could be a bit of a surprise for the shorts in the space. This short positioning is the most extreme it's been since 2020. Let's also check in on how markets in Asia are faring. Avril Hong is in our Singapore studio. And Avril, what are you watching this morning?
We're watching a really interesting picture emerging, Joumanna. I mean, after 3 sessions of losses, somehow the risk appetite is back in the Asia-Pacific. The gauge of stocks here higher, the benchmarks also climbing. I think it's another case of bad news for the economy, good news for markets, not just from that softer US GDP print, perhaps prompting those bets we'll see Fed easing, but also, don't forget, we got China PMIs today. Manufacturing sector, unexpected contraction. Maybe we see further support from Chinese authorities. This is what you're seeing among stocks, but we're also keeping an eye on the currencies. Offshore yuan and the Japanese yen both hovering flat against the greenback ahead of, as you say, those core PCE numbers out of the US. Okay, let's dig a little deeper into what we're getting from China data, because as I say, it was that factory activity contraction, but if you look under the hood, this is actually what's causing the concern. Output, new orders, that's slowing in the sub-indices, and the miss from that print on PMIs on manufacturing is the biggest in more than a year. This is a sector that has really been helping the Chinese economic recovery along, so that is why all this is raising concerns. Manufacturers might also face another risk in the pipeline given those trade tensions, Joumanna.
And also a big story that we have to think about heading into OPEC Plus, that demand coming out of China. And with another miss, certainly something for OPEC Plus producers to think about. Thank you, Avril, for that overview. Now, more on our top story. The guilty verdict in Donald Trump's New York hush money trial. His criminal convictions inject an unpredictable new variable into this year's presidential race. Bloomberg's David Gura was at the courthouse in Manhattan and sent this report.
As that verdict was announced, word of it made its way across the street to a park nearby where protesters had gathered along with supporters of the former president. There were cheers from one side and jeers from another. And the former president made his way down to the lobby of the courthouse to address reporters and his supporters. Looking ahead to November the 5th, that is when the general election will take place in the United States. Meanwhile, another date looms large. That is July the 11th. That is when the judge in this case, Juan Merchan, has said Donald Trump will be sentenced for the crimes of which he was found guilty. Each of those counts carries a maximum sentence of 4 years in prison. Of course, it's up to the discretion of Juan Merchan, the judge, to decide what kind of prison term the former president will get, if any. He could get no time in prison whatsoever. This now moves from this legal crucible where this trial has been taking place over the last few weeks into a political one. Again, the former president looking ahead to the general election and to the Republican National Convention before that, which is scheduled to start just days after that sentencing. David Gura, Bloomberg News.
Well, Trump now carries a tag unlike that of any other presidential hopeful in U.S. history, that of a convicted felon, changing the tenor of this year's U.S. election.
I imagine when Donald Trump and his attorneys speak today, that's exactly what they're going to say, is that they have every intention of filing an appeal immediately.
It's going to be a typical Trump news cycle in this respect. There's going to be a lot of noise. I don't think at the end it changes anything that dramatic. This is going to be a competitive presidential election. It was today. It'll be tomorrow. It was yesterday.
The small dollar donors, I'm sure, will come Trump's way in the immediate aftermath. Longer term, what does this look like for those swing states and those voters we keep talking about who are going to decide the election?
And now back to South Africa's elections, with the rand under pressure as investors fret over signs the ruling ANC may be forced into a coalition. Let's bring in William Gumede, founder and executive chairperson of the Democracy Works Foundation. Good morning to you, William. Thank you very much for joining us. Let me just start off by asking you what you make of these preliminary results that are coming through and the fact that ANC seem to be on track to lose their overall majority.
Good morning. Yes, I mean, this is a historical moment in the country. I mean, the end of the ANC is over 3 decades dominance of our politics and the humbling and almost, the reckoning of the ANC. And this was almost a referendum on the ANC's past performance and in government. And in the ANC, I mean, to stay in power, I think after this elections, we'll have to put together a coalition.
What does that coalition actually mean in practice? I know we don't know what it looks like, but what does it actually mean for governing? Because there hasn't been a governing coalition so far.
Yes, this is going to be the first time that we've seen in South Africa's modern era a national coalition where there's no majority. Last time we had a coalition was a government of national unity under former President Nelson Mandela. He put it together, although the ANC then in 1994 won a majority, and he put it together, for the sake of unity of the country to bring all races together. I mean, this time it's going to be very, very difficult putting something together because, the ANC doesn't have a minority. We'll have to look at potential partners, some of its enemies, like former President Jacob Zuma. He is Mkhonto Sizwe party that's been doing very, very well. Or he will have to look at economic freedom fighters. Another is a radical, populist party. Or really, for the sake of South Africa, might have to look for much more moderate partners from an economic point of view.
That's certainly going to be the big question, as my colleague Jennifer was explaining to us earlier. I thought it was interesting. You've recently written an opinion piece, and I'm going to read out what you said here because it is quite strong, saying that the loss of power is the ultimate motivator to fulfill promises. What do you mean by that?
Yes, in developing countries like South Africa, when there is, one-party dominance for too long, we don't get that economic growth, we don't get that accountability, and then South Africa has been very clear. ANC has been in power for too long and too complacent. So, I mean, the market reforms that we needed, the structural reforms that we needed, there was up to now no seriousness to do that because voters up to now voted the ANC in despite the ANC's performance and often based on the ANC's past as a movement against apartheid. And I think the uncertainty that we're now getting really brings the accountability.
So when I think of South Africa, for me, it is a country facing many economic issues. You talk about load shedding has been a structural issue for so many years now in South Africa. You talk about high unemployment. You talk about poverty. You talk about corruption. Can these opposition parties actually wield some influence on the economic trajectory of South Africa post these elections?
I mean, all the things you mentioned, power, our infrastructure collapse, the high levels of corruption, these are self-induced by the ANC in government because the ANC had absolutely no proper opposition to hold it accountable. With a coalition, I think for the first time since 1994, we will actually see some kind of accountability and some kind of urgency to deal with all of these structural issues, which are all of them, most of them self-induced. I mean, our unemployment is self-induced because the government has just poorly managed the state and the economy. The same with the infrastructure, which is really a binding constraint. Broken down infrastructure is a binding constraint to growth. And again, there hasn't been a political will to deal with these because the ANC was still complacent. And I think all of these things will now, I think there'll be much more impetus to deal with these structural reforms because if the ANC doesn't do it, if it's in a coalition, the next time the ANC will be out of power.
Yeah, and I think probably that's going to be the takeaway for ANC as well. William Gumede, founder and executive chairperson of the Democracy Works Foundation. Thank you. Also coming up, U.S. officials are putting limits on AI chip exports to the Middle East. But what does this mean for tech giants like NVIDIA? More on that next. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joumanna Bercetche in Dubai. Well, Bloomberg's being told that U.S. officials are slowing the issuing of licenses to chip makers such as NVIDIA and AMD for large-scale AI accelerator shipments to the Middle East. These are the chips which help data centers process the flood of information driving artificial intelligence. This comes as officials conduct a national security review of AI development in the region. Sources say they're particularly focused on high-volume sales and the technology being diverted to China. It is not known how long the review could take. However, it did have a major impact on equities into the close yesterday, particularly those chip makers. So let me just bring up the NASDAQ board. We ended the session down more than 1% yesterday. Today, the futures boards are also indicating that the NASDAQ is going to open up in the red, down 0.3%. And key here is we actually did see an underperformance of some of those key chip makers. NVIDIA, the stock that evidently keeps going up and up and up, actually was down 3.5% on the news yesterday when it came out. So very big story, and seems to indicate that the U.S. have growing concerns about these chip maker sales into the Middle East region. This, of course, has been a big topic over here within the region. The likes of UAE, Saudi Arabia have big aspirations, goals in terms of beefing up their own AI capabilities, and they're right in the middle of this U.S.-China cold tech war that has been playing out. So major theme for us over here. All right, we are going to cut to a break. We will be back in just a few moments, and we're going to talk more about the impact of what this means on China and its investments. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joumanna Bercetche in Dubai. Now, IATA's annual general meeting kicks off this weekend here in Dubai. For aviation executives, discussions around mid-air turbulence, summer travel, and industry regulation will feature high on the agenda. Joining me now is our global aviation reporter, Benedict Kamel. Wonderful to have you with us in Dubai, ahead of IATA. You know, as often with these conferences, it's always a good place to get a test for how people are feeling. You know, I'm very curious to see what sentiment on the ground is going to be like and how these airlines are feeling about upcoming summer demands.
Yeah, so this will be a big event. It's more than 100 executives all in one hotel, so it's a great opportunity for us to hook up with these people. You can meet them in the corridors, meet them in plenary sessions, and what we'll be looking for is sort of the strength of the industry, sort of how resilient is the industry. If you think back last year, it was all about the recovery from COVID. Obviously, the industry was in a really tough spot during COVID, and this year, you know, the question is, has the recovery been able to sort of take hold? Has it been able to sort of advance? That's what we'll be looking for. IATA will give out a forecast for the year saying this is how we see traffic developing, broken down by region. So that's something we'll take a very close look at. That will come out Monday morning. We have some really interesting interviews lined up, lots of people on Bloomberg TV, so tune in for that. So, yeah.
I love that little preview. You know, I feel many of us have recency bias, and I can't help but think of those couple of incidents of turbulence that have happened the last couple of weeks. One of them was fatal. To what extent are these incidents going to feature on the agenda, do you think? How are airlines going to respond to these increasing turbulence events?
It'll certainly be something that investors will be looking at, that the executives will be talking about, maybe not officially. I don't think there's an official turbulence session, as it were, but it will come up. And the question really is, how do you respond to that? If you think about how do you respond as a pilot, as a flight attendant, as a passenger, will they change regulations? aviation possibly. Right now, you know, we've all been on planes and you have to keep your seatbelt on during takeoff and landing. We are advised to take it off or to keep it on, but we can open it up during flight. That might change, that they will say, please keep it on throughout the entire flight. So we'll be looking out for that. That'll be quite interesting.
I certainly am going to keep my seatbelt on these flights going forwards. Why risk it? Boeing. That has been the major theme the last 6 months. Concerns over safety of the planes, but also delivery delays. And when we spoke to the Emirates chair a couple of weeks ago, he was saying that his biggest concern, or at least issue with Boeing right now, is their failure to deliver on time. How much of an issue is that going to be?
It has been an issue and will continue to be a big issue. You know, as you said, you spoke with Sheikh Ahmed a couple of weeks ago, and it's not just him. He's obviously one of the biggest buyers of Boeing aircraft, but across the industry, we've had this ripple effect from the Boeing crisis that they can't produce planes at the speed that they wanted to. That means that airlines can't get the planes that they want, and we are in a hot phase of aviation right now. People are clamoring for these aircraft. So that's certainly something that people will be talking about at the event. Where are our planes? When will we get them? How do we deal with older aircraft? Do we need to keep them going longer? It's not just Boeing, it's also Airbus. They've had some issues with some engines on their aircraft. So over the entire industry, we don't have sort of the number of aircraft that the industry really needs to sustain the growth that we've experienced.
Let me ask you a more regional focused question. On my actually very first Bloomberg Horizons show, I interviewed Tony Douglas, the CEO of Riyadh Air. So they're the new entrant on the block in the region. How is that going to shape up some of the regional dynamics with the other airlines?
So over here you have sort of the three big players. You have Emirates, you know, as the local champion. You have Qatar, you have Etihad. And now, as you say, Riyadh Air is trying to muscle into that market. And further to the north, you have Turkish. So there are these sort of 5 airlines trying to jockey for more business. And certainly people are taking a very close look at what Riyadh Air is doing. They haven't started operations yet, but they are building the airline. And that means they need to recruit people, which in turn means they might be poaching people, pilots, flight attendants, technicians from the other airlines. So everyone's taking a very close look at that.
Yeah, and well, the impact on personnel is going to be interesting.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
So final point, we have OPEC Plus coming up this weekend. To what extent does oil pricing, oil hedging factor into these discussions as well?
It's always a big point. You know, fuel is the single biggest expense for airlines, and it really shows in their bottom line. So low fuel cost is good for airlines, so they'll be taking a very close look at that. So, you know, if there's a positive sort of movement out of OPEC, and if there are good signals, it's always good for the industry.
Yeah. All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me on the set.
You.
Benedict Kamal, our global aviation reporter. And later today on Bloomberg Television, do not miss an interview with the Delta CEO, Ed Bastian, that is live from Dubai with Guy Johnson ahead of the IATA AGM. Right. We are going to take a look at OPEC Plus because it is coming up this weekend, and there are expectations that the curbs that were set in place towards the end of last year will remain in place until the end of this year. But of course, there is still a possibility that they may bring some surprises. Bloomberg out with a report overnight suggesting that some officials are having discussions about the possibility of extending those production curbs into 2025 as well. That would be deemed to be a bit of a surprise to the market, namely because, as we've been speaking about on the terminal chart, bearish positioning is at such extreme levels. The speculative short position right now in crude is the highest it has been since 2020, so something worth bearing in mind. All right, another story that we've been speaking about is Arab leaders' visit to China. So this comes as Chinese President Xi Jinping has been outlining his vision for greater cooperation with Arab nations, pointing to enhanced collaboration in areas including finance and technology. The leader addressed Middle East leaders in Beijing.
In key areas such as oil, gas, trade, and infrastructure. Step up fostering new growth areas such as artificial intelligence, investment, financing, and new energy, and embark together on an innovative and green path to prosperity.
Let's bring in Ben Hargberg, founder and managing partner of MSA Capital. How important is this Arab leader visit to China, Ben?
Huge. This is, China-Arab relations are at one of their all-time highs. The Middle East is obviously trying very much to play both sides and have a sufficient opportunity to do business and politic with both the Americans and North Americans as well as the Chinese. And benefit from addressing and using both of their technologies as well. She is here with Arab leaders and reestablishing that they are very much on the same page when it comes to economics and also geopolitics, as he made clear in the statement yesterday on Palestine.
Yeah. Ben, let me just ask you about this story that came out. Bloomberg reporting that U.S. are looking to restrict or slow down the sale of AI chips from the likes of AMD, NVIDIA to the Middle East region. This is a big example of how the region is caught between the U.S. and China. What ramifications are there?
Certainly, we're in a regional proxy war where the United States and China are vying for influence, and technology is one of those core battlefields. The Middle East, again, obviously wants to do business with American cloud and chip providers, as well as those from China, and particularly the UAE fancy themselves as kind of the third leg of the AI world. And so there's, they want to have access to the highest level computing chips, and those particularly are being produced by NVIDIA. Meanwhile, the Americans are constricting supply of those chips and also partnerships with the likes of Microsoft and OpenAI if the Middle Easterners, particularly the Emiratis, don't turn away from China. And so each side is kind of offering these carrots and sticks.
Yeah, Ben, thank you so much. Sorry we got cut a little short. Ben Harburg, founder, managing partner of MSA Capital. Thank you. That is it for Horizons Middle East, but stay with us because I'm doing the next show as well for Daybreak Europe.